Picture a flat, open plain stretching in every direction as far as the eye can see. No mountains to hide behind, no dense forest to slow and advance, just frozen earth, grey sky, and the silence of a Russian winter. The kind of silence that does not feel peaceful. It feels like a held breath. It is the winter of 1237 AD, and somewhere beyond the horizon, that silence is about to end. The town of Ryazan sits near the edge of Rus territory, close enough to the steppe that its people have always known danger could come from the east. When the first reports arrived that a vast army of horsemen was moving toward them, the princes of Ryazan did what any people under threat would do. They sent messengers to their neighbors, to the other princes of Rus, begging for soldiers and support. The answer they received was silence. Each prince was occupied with his own rivalries, his own feuds, his own calculations. Ryazan would have to face what was coming alone. What was coming was the army of Batu Khan, grandson of Chinggis Khan, leading the western campaign of the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever seen or would ever see. His cavalry did not simply outnumber the defenders. They operated with a discipline and coordination that the scattered, feuding princes of Rus had never encountered. They communicated across vast distances using relay riders. They carried out feints, encirclements, and coordinated strikes. They had studied siege warfare from the Chinese and brought with them engineers capable of breaching fortified walls. Against this force, individual princes making individual decisions stood no chance at all. Ryazan fell. The chronicle left by Russian monks does not spare the reader. It describes how the Mongols plundered the church, burned the prince's court, and systematically destroyed the town. The monks recording these events were specific about who was killed. The old, the sick, the blind, the lame. Killed where they lay. The young monks, priests, their wives and children were taken into captivity or pressed into service. There are no heroic last stands recorded in these chronicles. There is only the account of what fire and organized violence do to a place where ordinary people live. Over the following 3 years, Batu's cavalry moved through Rus methodically. Vladimir, Suzdal, Yaroslavl. Town after town faced the same pattern, a demand for submission, refusal, or inability to comply, and then destruction. The princes, instead of combining their forces, continued to act separately, which meant the Mongols could isolate and eliminate each one in turn. At no point during this entire campaign did the princes of Rus field a combined army against the invaders. The primary chronicle of the period, the foundational written record of East Slav history, does not try to hide this. The feuding was real. The failure was collective. What made the Mongol campaign so devastating was not simply the violence, though the violence was extreme. It was the speed. Cavalry armies of this kind could cover distances that no defending army of the period was organized to respond to. By the time word of one town's fall had reached the next, Batu's forces might already be within striking distance. The Mongols also deliberately targeted the infrastructure of Rus society. The churches where records were kept, the monasteries that served as centers of learning and administration, the trade routes that connected towns to one another. They were not simply raiding for plunder. They were eliminating the capacity to organize resistance. Modern historians working from both Rus chronicles and Mongol sources estimate that many towns lost the majority of their population, killed, enslaved, or displaced. Archaeological evidence from sites across this period confirms what the written records describe. Layers of ash, collapsed structures, populations that simply do not reappear in the record afterward. Some towns that existed before 1237 AD are not found in sources after it. They were not rebuilt. They were not resettled. They simply vanished. Yet Batu eventually stopped. Having swept through Rus, his armies pushed further west, into Poland and Hungary, inflicting defeats on European forces at Legnica and Mohi in 1241 AD. European rulers, including the Holy Roman Emperor, faced the genuine possibility that this force might continue westward indefinitely. Then, in 1242 AD, Batu turned back. The exact reasons remain a subject of historical debate. The death of the Great Khan in Karakorum required the Mongol leadership to return east. There were also practical limitations. The dense forests of northeastern Rus were difficult terrain for cavalry operations, and sustaining an army of that size across such distances presented enormous logistical challenges. Whatever the combination of reasons, Batu withdrew east and established the capital of his domain, the Ulis that historians call the Golden Horde, at Sarai on the lower Volga. From Sarai, the Golden Horde developed a system of control over the Rus principalities that did not require permanent military occupation. Each ruling prince had to travel to Sarai to receive an ayalik, a formal document granting him the right to rule. Without this document, a prince had no legitimacy. The Mongols retained the right to withdraw it, to grant it to a rival, or to summon princes for punishment. They appointed tribute collectors and conducted detailed censuses of the Rus population. A sophisticated administrative procedure that tells us the Golden Horde was not simply a raiding power, but a functioning imperial system with its own bureaucratic logic. The tribute burden was heavy. Regular payments were required in silver, furs, and recruits for military and labor service. Towns that resisted or failed to pay faced punitive raids. Over several generations, this imposed a continuous drain on the economy and population of Rus. Russian traditional memory, shaped by the chronicles written in monasteries, preserved the Mongol period as an unqualified catastrophe, a punishment from God for the sins of the princes, a dark age from which Rus had to be rescued. Long before the horsemen came, before the chronicles recorded ash and captivity and the silence of burned towns, there was a different kind of noise on the rivers of Eastern Europe. It was the noise of commerce, oars on water, merchants arguing prices, the creak of loaded boats moving south along the Dnieper toward the Black Sea, and north along the Volkhov toward the Baltic. This was the world that existed before 1237 AD, a world not of empires and armies but of trading routes, river towns, and the slow, complicated business of turning scattered tribes into something resembling a civilization. The people who built that world were the East Slavs, tribal groups spread across the vast forested plains of what is today Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. They were not unified. They did not share a single ruler or a single law. What they shared was language, broadly speaking, and the geography of the river systems that connected them. Those rivers were not just waterways. They were the arteries of an emerging economy, carrying amber, furs, wax, and honey south toward Byzantium, and bringing back silver, silk, and the sophisticated culture of the Greek Christian world. Into this network came the Varangians, the Norse traders and warriors whom the East Slavs called Rus. They came originally as merchants and raiders, then as settlers and rulers. The primary chronicle, the foundational written record of East Slav history, compiled over several decades in the Kievan Caves monastery, preserves a remarkable account of how this happened. The Slav tribes, it reports, were unable to govern themselves. Tribe rose against tribe. Discord was constant, and so, according to the chronicle, they sent a delegation across the water with a message that is one of the most candid invitations in the history of political organization. Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come and rule over us. Historians have debated for centuries whether this account reflects a single event or a gradual process. The consensus today leans toward the latter. That Varangian authority was established not through one dramatic invitation, but through the slow accumulation of trading relationships, military arrangements, and political dependencies over generations. But the chronicle's framing matters regardless of its literal accuracy. It tells us how the people who wrote it understood the problem their ancestors faced, the need for order imposed from outside when internal communities could not produce it themselves. That diagnosis of Russia's foundational problem, too much local feuding, not enough central authority, would be repeated by rulers, reformers, and ordinary people across the next 1,000 years. The Varangians established fortified settlements along the great trading route running from Scandinavia down to Byzantium. At the southern end of this route, on the high western bank of the Dnieper River, stood Kiev. It became the capital of the emerging realm, the seat of the Kagan, later called the Great Prince, from which authority was projected outward over the surrounding tribes. Around Kiev, a semicircle of fortresses was constructed to guard against raids from the nomadic peoples of the steppe to the south and east. The city itself grew into a genuine urban center, with its own craftsmen, merchants, clergy, and administration. What is striking about the early Kievan state is how quickly the Varangians ceased to be foreign. They intermarried with the local population. They adopted the East Slav language. Within a few generations, the ruling class was no longer distinguishable from the people it ruled in terms of culture or speech. A common East Slav identity emerged, not through conquest or forced assimilation, but through the ordinary processes of living together, trading together, and facing common threats together. At the base of this society were the village and urban communities. Villages organized themselves through assemblies called mir, a word that carries a weight of meaning beyond simple administration. Mir means peace, harmony, and the world simultaneously. These assemblies managed land distribution, resolved local disputes, and regulated the rhythms of agricultural life. In the towns, the equivalent institution was the vesh, a gathering of all male citizens with the right and duty to bear arms in defense of the community. The vesh was not a symbolic body. It had real power. It could invite a prince to rule or expel one it found unsatisfactory. The princes, for their part, maintained their authority through their druzhina, their armed retinues, and through the system of kormleni, which literally means feeding. Warriors and officials were entitled to be supported by local communities in exchange for providing protection and order. This was not taxation in the modern sense. It was a personal relationship between those who held power and those who lived under it. A give-and-take arrangement that required at least a minimum of mutual trust to function. When that trust broke down, the whole system became coercive and resented. When it held, it gave communities a stake in the protection offered and gave the powerful a reason to maintain peace, rather than simply extract resources and leave. The most consequential decision made by any Kievan ruler came in 988 AD, when Prince Vladimir chose to adopt Byzantine Christianity as the official religion of the realm. The primary chronicle surrounds this decision with legendary detail. Embassies sent to examine the faiths of neighboring peoples, the rejection of Islam because it banned alcohol, the overwhelming beauty of the Orthodox liturgy in Constantinople's Hagia Sophia, leaving Russian envoys uncertain whether they stood in heaven or on earth. These stories are almost certainly elaborations added by later writers who wanted the conversion to appear both divinely guided and historically inevitable. The political logic behind Vladimir's choice, however, was entirely real. Byzantine Christianity offered several things that a prince trying to consolidate authority desperately needed. It condemned blood feuds and justified the imposition of law and order by a legitimate ruler. It brought with it an entire administrative infrastructure, bishops, parishes, monasteries, scribes, that could extend the reach of central authority into places where no army could be permanently stationed. It connected Rus to the most sophisticated civilization within reach, Byzantium, whose trade, art, architecture, and legal tradition were resources a growing state could draw on. And it provided a shared moral framework that could, at least in principle, bind together populations whose primary loyalties had previously been to clan and tribe rather than to any larger community. Vladimir dispersed his sons to regional bases throughout the realm, each maintaining a druzhina and collecting kormleni from local communities. His son Yaroslav, who ruled from 1019 to 1054 AD and earned the epithet the Wise, took this work of consolidation further than anyone before him. He rebuilt Kiev as an imperial city in the Byzantine mold. Stone fortifications, a cathedral of St. Sophia named after Constantinople's greatest church, a golden gate for ceremonial processions. He promulgated the first written law code of the Rus lands, the Russkaya Pravda. And the word Pravda itself is worth pausing over. It means not simply truth, but justice, rightness, the proper order of things as ordained by God. The code's central achievement was to restrict blood feud and replace it with a calibrated system of fines for injury, murder, insult, and theft. To make fines work, you need both a functioning central authority and a stable monetary system. The very existence of the Russkaya Pravda tells us that Kievan Rus, at its height, had both. There is a moment in the life of every emerging civilization when it must decide what it believes. Not just what gods to worship, but what kind of place it wants to be in the world, what values will hold its people together when armies and trade routes are not enough. For Kievan Rus, that moment arrived in 988 AD, and the man who made the decision was Prince Vladimir of Kiev. Vladimir was not, by any account, a saint before he became one. The chronicles describe a ruler who maintained multiple wives and concubines, who had seized power through violence, and whose early reign was marked by the kind of brutal pragmatism common to rulers of his era. What changed him, or more precisely, what changed his calculation, was the recognition that a realm as geographically vast and tribally diverse as Kievan Rus needed more than military force to hold together. It needed a shared moral framework. It needed institutions that could reach into villages and towns that no prince could personally visit. It needed, in short, a religion with organizational capacity. The primary chronicle presents Vladimir's investigation of available faiths as a kind of spiritual audition. Envoys were sent to examine the religious practices of neighboring peoples. The Muslims of the Volga Bulgars were visited and found wanting, partly, the chronicle reports, because Islam forbade alcohol, and Vladimir concluded that drinking was the joy of the Rus, and they could not live without it. Jewish practice was examined but dismissed on the grounds that if God had truly favored the Jews, he would not have allowed them to be scattered from their homeland. Latin Christianity, practiced by the Germans and Poles to the west, was considered but rejected. It had less to offer in terms of the specific political and cultural connections Vladimir was seeking. Then the envoys went to Constantinople. What they witnessed there in the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, the soaring dome, the golden mosaics, the chanting that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, the liturgy conducted in a language related to their own, left them, according to the chronicle, unable to say whether they stood on earth or in heaven. They returned to Kiev and told Vladimir that they did not know how to describe what they had seen. They only knew that God was present there in a way they had not encountered elsewhere. The chronicle frames this as the decisive moment of spiritual recognition. But Vladimir was also making a geopolitical calculation of considerable sophistication. Byzantium was the wealthiest and most administratively advanced civilization within reach of Rus. An alliance sealed by shared religion would open doors that mere trade agreements could not. Byzantine Christianity also came with something Islam and Latin Christianity did not offer in quite the same way. It conducted its liturgy in a language close to the vernacular of the people, which meant ordinary believers could participate meaningfully rather than sitting through services in a language entirely foreign to them. And, critically, the Byzantine Church had a long tradition of accepting partnership with secular authority, of working alongside princes and emperors rather than claiming supremacy over them, as Rome increasingly did in the West. Vladimir's conversion was not a quiet personal matter. It was a state event of the first order. He was baptized, took the Christian name Basil, and then organized the mass baptism of Kiev's population in the Dnieper River. The chronicle records that he ordered his people to appear at the riverbank on a given day, and that those who did not come would be considered enemies of the prince. This was not a voluntary religious awakening. It was a political directive enforced by the authority of the ruler. The old idols that had stood on the hills above Kiev, including the principal idol of the Slavic thunder god, Perun, were torn down, dragged through the streets, and thrown into the river. What followed over the next decades was the systematic construction of an Orthodox Christian civilization across the Rus lands. Churches were built in every significant town. A network of parishes extended outward from the urban centers into the countryside. Monasteries were founded, and within them the work of writing, copying, and preserving texts began in earnest, including the chronicles that remain our primary source for everything we know about this period. The Church brought with it not only theology but literacy, architecture, painting, and law. It brought the concept of pravda, divine justice, as a standard against which human conduct could be measured. The relationship between the Church and the Kievan state was, from the beginning, a partnership of mutual benefit rather than subordination in either direction. The Church needed the prince's protection and resources to build its institutions. The prince needed the Church's moral authority to legitimize his rule and its administrative network to extend his reach. Two of the earliest saints of the Rus Church, Boris and Gleb, sons of Vladimir, were venerated precisely because they had refused to participate in dynastic violence, accepting death rather than fighting their brother for the throne. Their canonization sent a message about what Christian rulership was supposed to look like. Not the ruthless seizure of power, but the willing acceptance of suffering in the name of peace. The city of Kiev itself was transformed under Yaroslav the Wise in the decades following the conversion. The Cathedral of St. Sophia that Yaroslav built was not a modest parish church. It was a deliberate statement of civilizational ambition, a building designed to tell anyone who entered it that this was a serious power, connected to the greatest traditions of the Christian world, capable of producing something permanent and beautiful. The Kievan Caves Monastery, established on the steep bank of the Dnieper, became the spiritual heart of the realm, the place where the primary chronicle was compiled, where monks developed the theological and literary traditions that would shape Russian culture for centuries. The adoption of orthodoxy also created a boundary, though not immediately an obvious one. When the Byzantine and Roman churches formally split in 1054 AD, the year of Yaroslav's death, as it happened, Rus found itself on the eastern side of that divide. Contact with the intellectual and institutional life of Latin Western Europe, which had been limited but real, became more attenuated. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the gradual development of representative institutions in Western kingdoms. These were processes unfolding in a world that Rus was now less connected to than it might otherwise have been. This was not a disaster in the 11th century. It would become a complication in the 16th, a crisis in the 19th, and a defining tension of the 20th. The destruction was real. Let no administrative footnote soften what Batu Khan's armies did to the towns of Rus between 1237 and 1242 AD. The burned monasteries, the deported populations, the princes who died on frozen riverbanks without a single allied soldier beside them. These were not abstractions. They were the lived experience of an entire civilization being brought to its knees within the span of a single generation. And yet, history has a persistent habit of complicating its own catastrophes. What the Mongol conquest destroyed in 3 years, it also, unintentionally, indirectly, over the following century, helped to rebuild in a form more durable than what had existed before. Not because the Mongols were benevolent. They were not. But because the system they imposed on Rus, designed entirely for their own benefit, contained within it a set of tools that the most attentive of the surviving Russian princes would eventually turn to their own advantage. The Golden Horde, established at Sarai on the lower Volga, was not a simple raiding power content with periodic destruction. It was a functioning imperial administration with specific requirements. It needed reliable tribute. It needed order in the subject territories so that tribute could be collected without constant military intervention. It needed communication networks capable of transmitting information and commands across enormous distances. To achieve these things, it developed systems of governance that were, by the standards of the 13th and 14th centuries, remarkably sophisticated. The census the Mongols conducted across the Rus lands was not a rough estimate. It was a detailed enumeration of population and resources, designed to calculate exactly how much tribute each principality could bear. This kind of administrative precision was entirely new in the experience of Rus. The princes of Kiev had never conducted anything comparable. The Mongols also built and maintained a network of postal relay stations, the YAM system, stretching across their entire empire, allowing riders to cover distances in days that would otherwise have taken weeks. Along these routes moved not only military orders, but commercial goods, diplomatic correspondence, and the accumulated knowledge of a trade network that connected Rus through the Mongol heartland all the way to China. For the Orthodox Church, the Mongol period brought something unexpected: protection. The Mongols were, as a matter of deliberate imperial policy, tolerant of the religions practiced by their subject peoples. They had learned from experience that attacking the spiritual beliefs of conquered populations produced resistance that was far more costly to suppress than the tribute it might generate. The Church was therefore granted immunity from tribute obligations entirely. Its lands were exempted from the census. Its clergy were freed from military and labor conscription. At a moment when every other institution in Rus was subordinated to Mongol authority, the Church was left largely intact. And in that space of relative freedom, it grew. Monasteries accumulated land. New foundations appeared in the forests of the northeast, following the pattern described earlier. A monk seeking solitude, others gathering around him, a community forming where wilderness had been. The Church became, in the absence of a functioning Rus state, the primary institution capable of maintaining continuity across the fragmented principalities. The Metropolitan, traveling between dioceses and maintaining contact with all the surviving princes, embodied a unity that had no political equivalent. When secular authority was a collection of subordinate principalities paying tribute to a foreign Khan, the Church was the one body that could still claim to speak for Rus as a whole. The princes who navigated the Mongol system most skillfully were those who grasped this reality earliest. To receive an ehrlich, the Mongol document conferring the right to rule, a prince had to travel to Sarai, perform the required ceremonies of submission, and demonstrate to the Khan that he could be trusted to deliver tribute reliably and maintain order in his territory. This was humiliating by any measure, but it was also, for those willing to accept the humiliation, enormously advantageous. A prince with an ehrlich had Mongol backing against his rivals. He could suppress competitors and consolidate territory with an authority that no purely internal political arrangement could provide. Among the princes making these calculations, Alexander of Novgorod, later known as Alexander Nevsky, stands as one of the most consequential. Novgorod itself had escaped the main wave of Mongol destruction, its location in the dense northwestern forests making it an unattractive target for cavalry operations. But Alexander understood that refusing to acknowledge Mongol authority would invite exactly the kind of punitive raid that had destroyed towns further south. He negotiated carefully with the horde, paid generous tribute, and secured a special charter guaranteeing Novgorod's right of self-governance. In exchange, he delivered what the Mongols required. He could afford this accommodation partly because his military energies were directed elsewhere. The western frontier of Rus was under pressure from two directions simultaneously. the Swedes pushed south along the Gulf of Finland, and the Teutonic Knights, a crusading military order, were advancing eastward through the Baltic, threatening to cut Novgorod's trading routes and bring Latin Christianity by force to populations that had only recently adopted orthodoxy. Alexander defeated the Swedes in 1240 AD in a battle on the river Neva, earning the name Nevsky, and then, 2 years later, confronted the Teutonic Knights on the frozen surface of Lake Peipus. The Knights, heavily armoured and fighting in formations suited to solid ground, found the ice treacherous. The battle ended in their decisive defeat. Small principalities do not become empires by accident. They become empires through a specific combination of geographic advantage, dynastic continuity, and the kind of political patience that is indistinguishable, from the outside, from simple obedience. Moscow had all three. Daniil's son, Ivan, who ruled from 1325 to 1341 AD, was given a nickname by his contemporaries that tells you almost everything about his method: Kalita, meaning moneybags. It was not meant entirely as a compliment. Ivan accumulated wealth with a single-mindedness that his rivals found distasteful and his subjects found burdensome. He collected tribute for the Golden Horde with efficiency and regularity, and in the process quietly kept a portion for Moscow's own treasury. He used that accumulated wealth to subsidize neighboring princes, to attract their followers, and in some cases to simply purchase their loyalty outright. Territory that other rulers seized through war, Ivan acquired through financial leverage and patient negotiation. The Horde approved of him precisely because he was reliable. When other princes fell behind on tribute or showed signs of independent ambition, Moscow's prince delivered what was required on time, without complaint. The Ayalik of Great Prince, the document conferring authority over the other Rus principalities, passed to Ivan in 1328 AD, and with it came something more valuable than a title. It came with Mongol backing against any rival who might challenge Moscow's growing dominance. Ivan used that backing not to conquer but to consolidate, drawing neighboring territories into Moscow's orbit through a combination of financial inducement and the implicit threat of Mongol intervention for anyone who resisted. But Ivan's most significant achievement was not financial, it was ecclesiastical. In 1325 AD, the Metropolitan of all Rus, the head of the Orthodox Church across the former Kievan lands, relocated his seat to Moscow. Metropolitan Peter, who made this move, died shortly afterward and was buried in the city. Ivan immediately moved to have him canonized, and the tomb of a newly recognized saint in Moscow's principal church became a pilgrimage site. This was not piety for its own sake. A city that housed the tomb of a saint and that served as the seat of the metropolitan was no longer simply a political capital. It was a spiritual center, and in a civilization where the boundary between religious and political authority was genuinely blurred, that distinction carried enormous practical weight. The momentum Moscow built under Ivan Kalita continued through his successors, generation by generation. Each ruler added territory, consolidated control, and maintained the careful relationship with the Horde that kept Mongol interference at a minimum, while Mongol authority still served as a guarantee of Moscow's dominance over other princes. The system worked because Moscow never overreached. It never gave the Horde reason to view it as a threat. It was, to all outward appearances, the most loyal and cooperative of the subject principalities. Then, in 1380 AD, everything changed. The Golden Horde by this point was fracturing. The immense wealth generated by the Eurasian trade network had encouraged subordinate rulers to build their own power bases, and the unity that had made Batu's empire so formidable was dissolving into competing factions. One such faction was led by a warlord named Mamai, who had established his own independent Khanate west of the Volga and claimed authority over all of Rus. When Mamai moved against Moscow, he had secured an alliance with Lithuania, the same Western power that had been absorbing the southwestern Rus principalities for decades. The threat was real, and coordinated from two directions simultaneously. Prince Dmitry of Moscow made a decision that no Muscovite ruler before him had made. He chose to fight. The legend that grew around what followed places the blessing of Sergei of Radonej, the most revered monastic figure of the age, whose Trinity Monastery had become the spiritual heart of northeastern Rus, at the center of the story. Sergei reportedly urged Dmitry to go into battle and promised divine support. Whether this meeting occurred exactly as later accounts describe it is less important than what it signified. The fusion of Moscow's political ambitions with the moral authority of the Church, the framing of a military campaign against a rival Khan as a holy undertaking in defense of Christian Rus. The two armies met on the field of Kulikovo, near the upper river Don, in September 1380 AD. Dmitry's forces succeeded in repelling Mamai's cavalry before the Lithuanian allies could arrive to reinforce them. It was not a clean or simple victory. The battle was ferocious and Moscow's losses were severe. But Mamai was defeated, his alliance collapsed, and Dmitry returned to Moscow with a new epithet: Donskoy, the man of the Don. The Mongols were not finished. 2 years later, a different Khan raided Moscow and forced Dmitry to accept the Ayalik again. The practical supremacy of the horde was reasserted, but something had shifted that could not be shifted back. Kulikovo entered the memory of Rus not as a military turning point. It was not quite that, but as a moral one. For the first time, a Muscovite prince had stood on a battlefield against Mongol authority and not been destroyed. The chronicles written in the decades that followed transformed the battle into a foundational myth. Dmitry Donskoy as the saintly defender of Christendom, Sergei's blessing as the sign of divine favor, Kulikovo as the moment when God confirmed that Moscow was his chosen instrument. The myth did significant work. It reframed Moscow's entire history of Mongol collaboration, the tribute-paying, the careful cultivation of the horde's favor, the patient accumulation of advantage through submission, as merely a prelude to this moment of righteous resistance. The moneybags politics of Ivan Kalita disappeared behind the heroic narrative of Dmitry Donskoy. Moscow had not risen by learning from its conquerors. It had risen, the myth insisted, by defying them. Power, once consolidated, always needs a story to explain why it deserves to exist. Moscow had the power now. The Mongol yoke was broken. Novgorod's independence bell had been silenced. The principalities of the northeast had been absorbed one by one into a single Muscovite patrimony. Ivan III had achieved in a single lifetime what generations of patient accumulation had made possible. But raw territorial dominance was not, in the political culture of medieval Rus, sufficient justification for the authority it claimed. A ruler needed more than armies and tribute networks. He needed a mandate, ideally one that came from God. The mandate arrived from an unexpected direction. In 1453 AD, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. For the Orthodox world, this was an event of shattering theological significance. Byzantium had been more than a political power. It had been the living proof that God's favor rested on the Christian empire, the continuation of Rome itself, the guardian of the one true faith. When Ottoman artillery breached the walls of Constantinople and Sultan Mehmed II rode into Hagia Sophia, the building that Rus envoys had once described as heaven on earth, the entire framework of Orthodox political theology was suddenly without its anchor. Moscow's churchmen responded with a speed and clarity that suggested they had been thinking about this possibility for some time. If Byzantium had fallen, who now bore responsibility for the true Christian faith? Who was the legitimate heir to Rome's imperial mission? The answer, in the view of the Muscovite Church, was obvious. There was only one large independent Orthodox realm remaining in the world. There was only one ruler whose authority had not been swallowed by the Ottoman Empire. Moscow was not simply a successor state to Kievan Rus, it was the successor to Byzantium itself, the Third Rome, the final guardian of true Christianity, the city upon which the fate of Christendom now rested. This argument was given its most powerful formulation by a monk named Philofey of Pskov, who wrote an epistle, probably addressed to Ivan III, that contained one of the most consequential sentences in Russian political history. "Two Romes have fallen," Philofey wrote. "The third stands, and there will be no fourth." The warning embedded in this declaration was unmistakable. The first Rome had fallen to heresy. The second Rome, Constantinople, had fallen to the infidel. If the third Rome, Moscow, failed in its divine responsibility, there would be no further chance. History itself would end. The weight of the entire Christian world rested on the shoulders of the Muscovite ruler. The political implications of this ideology were enormous, and not entirely comfortable for the princes who were supposed to benefit from it. The Third Rome concept gave Moscow's ruler a universal religious mission that elevated him above every other Christian monarch. But it also placed him under an obligation that the Church could use to constrain him. Philofey's letter was not written as flattery. It was written as a warning against the prince's intention to expropriate church lands for distribution to his military servitors. The message was clear. A ruler entrusted with the fate of Christendom had better govern righteously, and righteousness, as the Church defined it, included respecting ecclesiastical property. Ivan III absorbed the ideological benefit of the Third Rome concept, while quietly ignoring its more inconvenient implications. He adopted new symbols of imperial authority: the double-headed eagle of Byzantium, the elaborate ceremonial of a Byzantine court. He married Sophia Palaiologina, niece of the last Byzantine emperor, a union that connected Moscow's ruling dynasty directly to the imperial bloodline of Constantinople. These were not sentimental gestures. They were calculated statements about legitimacy, designed to position Moscow as the natural heir to the greatest Christian empire that had ever existed. The Church itself underwent a transformation during this period that reflected the new weight it was being asked to carry. Monasteries had multiplied across the northeastern forests during the Mongol centuries, accumulating land and resources as they went. By the late 15th century, the Church was one of the largest landowners in Rus, with extensive estates, dependent peasants, and the financial capacity to act as an independent force in political life. Two factions within the Church debated what this wealth meant. The possessors, led by the abbot Iosif of Volokolamsk, argued that monastic wealth was justified because it funded charitable work, education, and the Church's civilizing mission across the empire's expanding territories. The non-possessors, following the tradition of the hermit monks who had built their simple shelters in the forest, seeking spiritual poverty, argued that wealth corrupted the Church's spiritual authority, and that monasteries should divest their estates and return to lives of genuine poverty. This was not simply a theological dispute. It was a contest over whether the Church would remain an independent institutional power or become subordinate to the state. Ivan III and his successors needed church lands for distribution to their military servitors. The pomeshchiki, whose service obligations formed the backbone of Muscovite military power. The non-possessors, paradoxically, offered the state what it wanted: a church stripped of its independent economic base and therefore more dependent on princely favor. But the non-possessors also tended to be more resistant to state interference in spiritual matters. The possessors, who defended church wealth, were simultaneously defending church independence. And they were willing to use the Third Rome ideology as leverage, reminding the prince that a ruler who plundered the Church of God's chosen empire was courting the fate of the first two Romes. The possessors won the institutional argument. The Church retained its lands through the 15th and into the 16th century. But the deeper question, whether the Church was a partner to the state or a subordinate of it, remained unresolved, and its resolution, when it eventually came, would not favor the Church. The question left hanging at the end of Moscow's divine coronation found its answer sooner than anyone expected. and in a form more disturbing than most could have imagined. Ivan IV came to the throne as a minor, his early years governed by competing boyar factions who used the young prince's helplessness to advance their own interests and settle their own scores. He watched from close range as the men who were supposed to serve the state treated it as personal property. He saw how quickly loyalty evaporated when power was uncertain. By the time he was old enough to rule in his own name, he had developed a view of the boyar class that combined genuine political insight with a paranoia so deep it would eventually consume everything he built. His early reign showed what the insight looked like without the paranoia. He convened gatherings of regional representatives, what historians call zemsky sobery, assemblies of the land, to consult on major policy decisions. He issued a new law code in 1550 AD that attempted to regularize the obligations of service and the rights of communities across the realm. He launched a sustained military campaign eastward, conquering the Khanate of Kazan in 1552 AD and Astrakhan in 1556 AD, extending Muscovite authority across the entire Volga basin and opening the path towards Siberia. These were genuine achievements, the work of a ruler who understood that empire required administration as much as it required armies. The service decree of 1556 AD was particularly significant. It codified precisely what every military servitor owed the state in exchange for his estate. How many armed men, how many horses, what weapons, and established a military chancery to enforce these obligations through systematic record-keeping. This was the bureaucratic infrastructure of empire, unglamorous but essential, the machinery that allowed a state of Muscovy's size to function as a coherent military organism rather than a collection of loosely affiliated armed camps. Then the paranoia took over. In 1553 AD, Ivan fell seriously ill. Believing he was dying, he required his boyars to swear loyalty to his infant son, Dmitry. Many of them hesitated. Some supported a cousin as a more viable successor. Ivan recovered, but he never forgot that hesitation. In his mind, reluctance to swear an oath to his son was not a practical political calculation. It was treason. From that moment, the conviction grew in him that the boyar class was fundamentally disloyal, that enemies surrounded him, and that the only way to secure his dynasty and his state was to destroy the independence of the aristocracy entirely. His method was theatrical, calculated, and brutal in equal measure. In December 1564 AD, Ivan suddenly abandoned Moscow. He loaded his family, his treasury, and his most beloved icons onto sledges and withdrew to a country residence outside the city. From there, he sent 2 letters simultaneously. One to the boyars and church leaders accusing them of treason and obstructing his efforts to govern, and one to the ordinary people of Moscow, reassuring them that his anger was directed at their oppressors, not at them. The people, as the chronicle records, responded with a petition begging him to return. Who would defend them from foreign enemies? How could they live without a lord? It was a performance, and a masterful one. Ivan had demonstrated in a single gesture the political logic that would justify everything that followed. The ordinary people needed the Tsar to protect them from the boyars, and therefore the Tsar's actions against the boyars, however extreme, were acts of protection rather than tyranny. He returned to Moscow on his own terms with the right to proceed against traitors as he saw fit. What he created next had no real precedent in Russian governance. He divided the realm into 2 separate territories, one called the Oprichnina, a word meaning roughly the widow's portion, a separate personal domain. He kept under his own direct control, expropriating its boyar landowners and awarding their ancestral estates to his own personal servitors. The other territory, the Zemshchina, he left to the boyars to administer under traditional arrangements. His personal force, the Oprichniki, rode on black horses and carried at their saddles a dog's head and a broom, symbols of their function, to sniff out treason and sweep it away. When a dynasty ends, it does not simply leave a vacant throne. It leaves a vacuum, And vacuums in the political world fill with whatever happens to be nearest and most desperate. Fedor died in 1598 AD without an heir. The Rurikovich dynasty, which had provided Rus with its rulers in unbroken succession since the first Varangian princes settled along the Dnieper, was finished. What followed was not a smooth transfer of power. It was 15 years of cascading catastrophe that Russians would remember for centuries afterward as the Smuta, the time of troubles, a period so destabilizing that it threatened to erase Muscovy as a political entity entirely. The first attempt to fill the vacuum came from Boris Godunov, a capable administrator who had effectively governed during Fedor's reign, and who was elected Tsar by a Zemsky Sobor in 1598 AD. His election was legally sound by the standards of the time, but it carried a fatal weakness that no administrative competence could overcome. Boris was a boyar, not a Rurikovich. The obligations that subjects had accepted from Ivan IV, however harsh, however costly, had rested on the conviction that the Tsar's authority derived from God through the dynasty. A boyar elected by an assembly was a different proposition entirely. The same service demands that had been bearable from an anointed Tsar became intolerable from a man whose claim rested on nothing more sacred than a vote. Boris's reign was also struck by a natural catastrophe of devastating proportions. Between 1600 and 1603 AD, a series of harvest failures produced a famine that killed an estimated 1/3 of the population in the most severely affected regions. Peasants abandoned their villages. Desperate people flooded into the towns. Bandits multiplied across the countryside. Boris organized relief efforts and distributed grain from state reserves, but the scale of the disaster overwhelmed any governmental response. The famine became, in the minds of those who survived it, evidence of God's judgment. Confirmation that a non-dynastic Tsar was an offense against divine order. Into this atmosphere of legitimacy crisis and mass suffering came a figure who understood exactly how to exploit both. A young man appeared in Poland claiming to be Dmitry, the youngest son of Ivan IV, who had died in mysterious circumstances in 1591 AD, officially by accidentally stabbing himself during an epileptic fit, though rumors of murder had circulated from the beginning. This false Dmitry, as historians call him, gathered Polish backing, crossed into Muscovite territory, and found support not from foreign armies alone, but from Russian frontier servicemen, Cossacks and peasants who preferred the hope of a legitimate Tsar to the reality of Boris Godunov. Boris died in 1605 AD, possibly of natural causes, possibly not. His son was murdered within weeks. The false Dmitry entered Moscow and was crowned Tsar. He lasted less than a year before a boyar conspiracy, led by Vasily Shuisky, had him killed and threw his body from a window. Shuisky then had himself elected Tsar by a group of Muscovite nobles, a selection so narrow in its base of support that it commanded almost no loyalty outside the capital. What followed descended into a complexity that defies simple narrative. A second false Dmitry appeared, drawing support from Cossacks and disaffected Russians who refused to recognize Shuisky. Polish forces intervened militarily, eventually occupying Moscow itself in 1610 AD. Swedish forces occupied Novgorod. Cossack bands under their own leaders moved through the countryside, plundering towns and villages with no political program beyond immediate advantage. Peasants who had suffered through famine, dynastic chaos, and the Oprichnina's long shadow turned their accumulated grievances into violence against anyone who represented authority. The bureaucratic machinery that Ivan IV had built, and that had survived his destruction of the human beings who ran it, was now operating in a political vacuum, issuing decrees that no one was obliged to follow. At the lowest point, with a Polish garrison inside the Kremlin, a Swedish army in Novgorod, and no legitimate Tsar anywhere, the question was not who would rule Muscovy. It was whether Muscovy would survive at all. The answer came not from any prince or army, but from the institutions that the time of troubles had left intact, almost by accident. The Orthodox Church, whose patriarch Germagan had been imprisoned by the Polish-backed faction in Moscow, managed to smuggle epistles out of his captivity addressed to the town assemblies across the realm. His message was not military, it was moral. No Orthodox Christian could swear loyalty to a Catholic ruler. The defense of Muscovy was the defense of the true faith. Communities had not only the right, but the obligation to resist. In Nizhny Novgorod, a merchant and community elder named Kuzma Minin stood before his town's assembly and made an appeal that the chronicles preserved in careful detail. He called on his fellow citizens to form a militia and contribute whatever resources they could spare, including, he said, their wives' jewelry and their own property, if necessary. The appeal worked not because Minin was a charismatic military leader, he was not, but because the joint responsibility that had organized Russian communities for centuries now activated itself at the scale of the entire realm. Town after town responded. Detachments converged on Yaroslavl on the Volga, placing themselves under the military command of a boyar prince named Dmitry Podzarsky. The militia that marched on Moscow in 1612 AD was not a royal army. It had no Tsar behind it, no dynastic legitimacy, no Mongol-granted ehrlich. What it had was the collective determination of local communities who had decided that foreign occupation of the Orthodox capital was a line that could not be held. The Polish garrison was expelled. Moscow was recovered. And the Kremlin, which had housed the hammer of Ivan IV's terror and the chaos of competing pretenders, was back in Russian hands. The Zemsky Sobor that assembled in 1613 AD to elect a new Tsar faced a choice shaped by exhaustion as much as wisdom. Foreign candidates were rejected outright. Patriarch Germagan's insistence that no Catholic could rule had taken hold completely. Among Russian candidates, the assembly settled on a 16-year-old boy named Mikhail Romanov, whose primary qualifications were that he was distantly related to Ivan IV's first wife, that his family had not made enough enemies to be disqualifying, and that he was young enough that the boyars who elected him expected to manage him. The Romanov dynasty that Mikhail founded stabilized Muscovy, rebuilt its administrative machinery, and restored enough order that ordinary life became possible again. His son, Alexei, and grandson, Fedor III, continued the work of reconstruction quietly and without drama. But quiet reconstruction was not going to solve the problem that was becoming increasingly visible to anyone who looked westward with clear eyes. Europe was changing at a speed that Muscovy was not matching. The states to Russia's west, Sweden, Poland, the Dutch Republic, England, France, were developing standing armies equipped with the latest firearms technology, financed by tax systems sophisticated enough to sustain permanent military establishments, and administered by bureaucracies trained in the emerging disciplines of statecraft. Muscovy had its own bureaucracy, its own army, its own traditions of governance. But the gap between what Russia had and what its Western neighbors were building was widening with each decade. The Crimean War would make this gap catastrophically visible in the 19th century, but a ruler paying close attention could see it clearly enough in the 1680s. Peter I was paying very close attention. He came to power in circumstances of considerable violence. A palace coup, the murder of relatives before his eyes as a child, a co-regency with his half-brother Ivan V that left real power in the hands of his half-sister Sophia until he was old enough to take it by force. These early experiences gave him what Ivan IV had also possessed, a visceral understanding of how quickly power could be lost and how little sentiment had to do with its preservation. But where Ivan had turned that understanding inward, toward the destruction of his own elite, Peter turned it outward, toward the transformation of Russia into something capable of competing with the powers that surrounded it. In 1697 and 1698 AD, Peter did something no Russian ruler had done before. He left Russia and traveled to Western Europe as part of a large diplomatic mission. And within that mission, traveling under a thin disguise as a common worker, He spent months in the Dutch Republic and England working in shipyards with his own hands. He studied naval architecture, watched how Western industries operated, recruited skilled craftsmen and engineers, and absorbed everything he could about the technical and organizational foundations of European military and commercial power. He returned to Russia with hundreds of foreign specialists under contract and a head full of plans that would take the rest of his life to implement. The reforms he launched were staggering in their scope and in the unapologetic coercion with which they were imposed. He created Russia's first permanent standing army, funded through a poll tax collected through the landlords who could enforce joint responsibility on their villages. Soldiers served for life. They left their villages permanently, received uniforms and regular pay, and were subject to a military discipline of extraordinary harshness. When peasant men were conscripted, their village communities sometimes held symbolic funerals for them, because everyone understood that departure for the army was departure forever. Yet these soldiers, stripped of their serf status and forged into a professional military force, fought with a determination that surprised Europe. At the Battle of Poltava in 1709 AD, the Russian army decisively defeated Sweden, at that point the dominant military power in Northern Europe, and confirmed Russia's arrival as a force that could not be ignored. Peter built a navy and stationed it in the Baltic, declaring permanently Russia's intention to operate in European waters. To anchor this naval presence and to serve as the physical embodiment of his break with Muscovite tradition, he began construction of an entirely new city on territory recently conquered from Sweden at the eastern end of the Gulf of Finland. St. Petersburg was built on marshland at enormous human cost. Workers died by the thousands in its construction, and it was designed from the beginning as a European city. Its streets were laid out on a rational grid. Its public buildings were designed by architects from Italy, France, and Germany in the Baroque style. Its canals echoed Amsterdam. It was, quite deliberately, a city that looked nothing like Moscow. The symbolic weight of St. Petersburg extended beyond architecture. By moving the capital from Moscow to this new western-facing city, Peter was making a statement about Russia's identity and direction that every subject was meant to understand. Moscow was the third Rome, the holy city, the seat of the Patriarchate and the center of Orthodox civilization. St. Petersburg was something else entirely. A city of ships and commerce and European diplomatic life, a city oriented toward the future rather than the sacred past. The Church felt the implications of this reorientation immediately and directly. Peter abolished the Patriarchate, the institution that the Orthodox world had formally recognized as the spiritual center of the Third Rome only a century earlier, and replaced it with a body called the Holy Synod, an administrative board of senior bishops whose chairman could be, and sometimes was, a layman appointed by the emperor. His ecclesiastical advisor, Feofan Prokopovich, provided the theological justification. The idea of two equal powers, Tsar and Patriarch, had misled believers into imagining Russia had two rulers, which created confusion and potential conflict. There should be one sovereign answerable to God alone, whose will was itself an expression of divine law. The practical consequences for parish clergy were significant. Priests were now required to report to state authorities anything they heard in confession that might endanger state security. The seal of the confessional, one of the most fundamental protections of the pastoral relationship, was subordinated to the political needs of the state. Clergy became, in effect, agents of surveillance as well as ministers of the soul. The old believers, who had already rejected the 17th century liturgical reforms as the work of the Antichrist, now had fresh evidence for their conviction that the Russian state had been captured by demonic forces. To many of them, Peter himself was the Antichrist. A ruler who had abolished the Patriarchate, forced his subjects to shave the God-given beards that Orthodox tradition treated as a sign of masculine dignity, dressed the nobility in German clothes, and built his capital on a swamp rather than in the holy city where the saints were buried. Peter's Table of Ranks, issued in 1722 AD, reorganized the entire social hierarchy of the Russian elite around the principle of state service. It created 14 grades of military, civilian, and court service, with promotion depending in theory on merit and demonstrated competence rather than on birth and family connection. Nobles who had previously inherited their social status now had to earn it through service, or at least demonstrate that they were performing it. Army officers were required to serve as private soldiers before receiving a commission, a humiliation that the old aristocracy found deeply offensive but ultimately accepted, because the Table of Ranks also opened the door to ennoblement through service for men of non-noble origin, which meant the existing nobility had strong incentives to participate actively rather than cede ground to newcomers. Peter had forced Russia into Europe by sheer willpower and imperial decree. What he could not force was Europe's acceptance of Russia as a genuine equal rather than a powerful but unsettling newcomer. That acceptance, and the deeper question of what kind of state Russia actually wanted to be, fell to a ruler who had not been born Russian at all. Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst arrived in Russia at the age of 14 as a prospective bride for the future emperor Peter III. She was a minor German princess from an obscure principality, chosen precisely because her family had no significant political connections that might complicate court dynamics. She learned Russian with remarkable speed, converted to Orthodoxy with apparent conviction, and took the name Ekaterina, Catherine. She watched and she read and she waited. When her husband, Peter III, managed within 6 months of his accession to alienate the Guards regiments, the church, and virtually every significant faction at court simultaneously, Catherine was ready. In July 1762 AD, the Guards moved against Peter. He abdicated. Within days he was dead, killed almost certainly, by officers acting on behalf of the new empress, though Catherine's personal knowledge of and consent to the murder has never been definitively established. She had seized power through a coup, which meant she needed legitimacy more urgently than rulers who inherited their thrones. She found it in 2 places simultaneously: in the theory of enlightened monarchy that was the dominant intellectual fashion of 18th century Europe, and in the practical consolidation of noble support that was the actual foundation of any Russian ruler's security. Catherine corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot, the leading philosophers of the European Enlightenment, with a fluency and genuine engagement that was not mere performance. She read seriously, thought seriously, and produced serious writing of her own. In 1767 AD, she undertook what was, by any measure, an extraordinary political experiment. She convened an elected legislative commission, a body representing state officials, nobles, merchants, Cossacks, state peasants, and non-Russian communities, and placed before it a lengthy document called the Nakaz, or Instruction, in which she laid out her vision of how Russia should be governed. The Nakaz drew heavily on the work of Montesquieu and the Italian legal reformer Beccaria, arguing for the rule of law, the limitation of torture, and the importance of clear and consistent legislation. The experiment revealed something important and uncomfortable. When the deputies arrived with their petitions and proposals, the overwhelming majority were concerned almost entirely with the interests of their own particular estate or community. Nobles wanted their privileges confirmed. Merchants wanted protection from noble competition. State peasants wanted relief from their obligations. Nobody was thinking about Russia as a whole. Catherine had hoped the commission would help her build a legal foundation for rational governance. What it showed her instead was that Russian society, as it existed, lacked the intermediate institutions and civic culture that would have made such a project possible. She dissolved the commission when the Turkish War of 1768 AD provided a convenient excuse and never reconvened it. But she used its materials in subsequent legislation, and the exercise had taught her something that shaped everything she did afterward. The lesson was institutional. Russia needed functioning bodies between the central state and the population. Bodies capable of managing local affairs, resolving disputes, and connecting the concerns of ordinary people to the decisions being made in St. Petersburg. She attempted to create them through her provincial reform of 1775 AD, which reorganized the empire into provinces and districts and gave the nobility a formal role in local administration. Her charter to the nobility of 1785 AD went further. It guaranteed noble property rights, freed nobles from corporal punishment, and established noble assemblies in each province with real administrative powers. For the first time, a defined class in Russia had legally guaranteed rights that the crown was formally bound to respect. The consequences for everyone else were severe. By establishing the nobility as the one estate with guaranteed rights, Catherine had by implication confirmed that no such guarantees extended to the serfs those nobles owned. Serfdom under Catherine became more arbitrary and more brutal than at any previous point in Russian history, precisely because the legal framework that might have constrained it had been channeled entirely toward protecting the masters rather than the owned. Noble landlords could sell serfs without land, separate families, impose any labor obligation they chose, and punish disobedience with essentially unlimited violence. The serfs had no legal recourse. They had no right to petition the throne against their masters. They existed, in legal terms, as property. The human consequences of this system exploded into visibility between 1773 and 1775 AD, when the largest popular rebellion in Russian history before 1917 AD tore through the southeastern regions of the empire. Its leader was Emelian Pugachev, a Don Cossack who had converted to the old belief and who claimed to be the murdered emperor, Peter III, returned to deliver justice to those the system had crushed. Pugachev's genius was in understanding exactly what the people around him believed a legitimate Tsar should do. His manifestos promised freedom from serfdom, abolition of the poll tax, return of lands to the communities from which they had been taken, and the restoration of the old belief as the true faith of Russia. He addressed himself to Yaik Cossacks whose traditional freedoms had been abolished, to Bashkir tribesmen whose grazing lands had been seized, to factory serfs in the Ural ironworks who labored under conditions of near slavery, and to ordinary peasants across the Volga region who had nothing left to lose. At its height, Pugachev's rebellion controlled a vast territory, captured multiple towns, and executed nobles and officials with the same systematic efficiency that the state had long applied to rebellious peasants. Catherine was shaken enough to send one of her best military commanders to suppress it. The campaign took nearly 2 years. Pugachev was eventually betrayed by his own lieutenants, transported to Moscow in an iron cage, and publicly executed in January 1775 AD. The rebellion was over. Its underlying causes were not addressed in any meaningful way. Catherine drew from it the lesson that any weakening of noble authority over the serfs risked unleashing forces the state could not control, and she tightened the system further. Empires are measured by their conquests, their rulers, their wars. But the vast majority of people living inside any empire spend their lives at an entirely different scale. The scale of the village, the harvest, the winter, the landlord's mood, the neighbor's debt. For most of Russian history, that ordinary scale was the only one that mattered to the people living it. And understanding it changes the picture considerably. By the 18th and early 19th centuries, roughly 80 to 90% of Russia's population were peasants. Most of them were serfs, bound to the land, obligated to their landlords or to the state, subject to the full weight of the joint responsibility system that had organized rural life since the earliest Muscovite period. On paper, their situation looked indistinguishable from slavery. In practice, it was considerably more complicated than that. Not less brutal, but more structured, and that structure gave ordinary people tools for survival that the formal legal record entirely obscures. The fundamental unit of peasant life was the commune, the Mir. This was not simply a geographic community, it was an active institution of self-governance that managed almost every aspect of agricultural and social life within the village. The commune decided how the strips of arable land would be distributed among households, taking into account the size of each family and its capacity to work. It organized the rotation of crops across the village's fields, which meant that no single household could simply farm as it pleased. Agricultural decisions were collective decisions, made in the village assembly where all male heads of household had a voice. The commune also periodically redistributed land strips to reflect changes in household size. A family that had grown since the last redistribution received more land. A family that had shrunk received less. This was not generosity. It was the logic of joint responsibility. Every household needed enough resources to meet its obligations, because if one household failed, the others had to cover the shortfall. This system imposed a profound collective discipline on village life. Peasants watched each other with an attention that was simultaneously supportive and ruthless. A neighbor who was falling behind on obligations through illness, laziness, or misfortune was first helped because the community needed him to survive. If help failed to produce results, the community could become merciless because his failure threatened everyone. Wastrels and persistent drunkards were not tolerated indefinitely. The commune had mechanisms for expelling households that became chronic liabilities, and it used them. The strip system itself, which distributed land of varying quality across different parts of the village's territory, served a specific purpose that made sense in the Russian agricultural context. The soils of most Russian farming regions were thin, prone to waterlogging in some areas, and drought in others, and the difference between a good strip and a bad strip in a given year was unpredictable. By giving each household land in multiple locations, the commune spread risk across the entire community. No single household bore the full consequences of a localized failure. This was risk management by collective design, not by any formal theory of economics, but by generations of accumulated practical wisdom about how to survive in a harsh climate on marginal soils. The landlord existed above this system, extracting from it either labor, Bosch-China, the obligation to work the lord's fields for a specified number of days per week, or rent paid in cash or produce, called obrok. The balance between these two forms of obligation varied by region and by individual landlord. In the fertile black earth regions of the south, where land was valuable and labor-intensive cultivation profitable, Bosch-China predominated and could consume 3 or more days of a serf's working week. In the less fertile north, where the land itself was less rewarding, obrok was more common, which gave peasants more flexibility in how they organized their time and even allowed some to pursue trades or seasonal labor that took them away from the village. Within these constraints, peasant communities displayed a resilience and adaptability that repeatedly surprised the officials and landlords who assumed them to be passive objects of exploitation. Serfs negotiated with their landlord's stewards over the terms of their obligations. They appealed, sometimes successfully, to provincial authorities when those terms were violated in ways that crossed even the loose legal standards of the time. They petitioned. They dragged their feet on obligations they considered illegitimate. They ran away in numbers large enough that the state's repeated attempts to legislate fugitive serfs back to their masters tell their own story about how effective those attempts actually were. The spiritual life of the village ran through the parish church and through a dense calendar of saints' days, seasonal festivals and ritual observances that organized the year in ways the agricultural cycle alone could not. The village priest was a figure of genuine importance, but his relationship with his parishioners was less hierarchical than the official church structure implied. In many villages, the priest had been chosen by the community rather than appointed from above, and he lived among his parishioners at roughly their economic level, farming his own allotment, subject to the same weather and the same anxieties, conducting liturgies that his congregation participated in through a tradition of call and response rather than passive observation. Alongside the official liturgical calendar ran an undercurrent of older practices that the Church had been trying to extirpate since Vladimir's baptism of the Dnieper, and had never entirely succeeded. Seasonal rituals connected to planting and harvest, protective charms against illness and misfortune, the veneration of sacred springs and ancient trees, the consultation of local healers and wise women whose knowledge of herbs and remedies operated entirely outside ecclesiastical sanction. The zealots of piety in the 17th century had railed against these practices. Peter I had legislated against them. None of it made a decisive difference. The village absorbed official religion and maintained its older layers simultaneously, finding in the combination a spiritual life richer and more practically useful than either tradition offered alone. The system that Catherine had perfected, autocracy supported by a Europeanized noble elite, resting on the labor of an enserfed peasantry, entered the 19th century looking outwardly stable. Then, in the summer of 1812 AD, the largest army ever assembled in European history crossed into Russian territory, and everything that the system was and was not became suddenly, brutally visible. Napoleon Bonaparte had defeated virtually every major European power. His Grande Armée numbered over 400,000 men at the point of crossing, drawing on French, Polish, German, Italian, and other contingents assembled from across the continent he dominated. Against this force, Russia had capable generals, a large army, and one strategic asset that no amount of French military genius could neutralize: space. The decision to retreat rather than stand and fight was not announced as a strategy. It could not be. To tell an army and a people that their plan was to yield their own territory, allow their towns to be occupied and their farms stripped, and hope that distance and winter would do what their soldiers could not. This was not a message any commander could deliver openly without destroying the morale he needed to sustain the retreat itself. Alexander I and his commanders declared at each defensive line that they would hold there. Each time, they did not. The army fell back and fell back again, drawing Napoleon deeper into a country whose resources were vast, but whose distances were punishing. The Battle of Borodino in September 1812 AD was the stand that could not be avoided. Moscow lay just ahead, and to abandon it without a fight was politically unthinkable. The two armies met on a field near the village of Borodino and fought one of the bloodiest single days of combat in European history to that point. Russian casualties were enormous. The result was technically a French victory. The road to Moscow was open afterward, but Napoleon's army was significantly weakened, and the Russian army, though battered, remained intact. Commander Kutuzov made the decision that his predecessors had avoided. He would not defend Moscow. The army would withdraw, preserve itself, and fight another day. Napoleon entered Moscow expecting the surrender that had always followed his victories elsewhere in Europe. He waited in the Kremlin for Russian envoys to arrive with terms. None came. Instead, fires broke out across the city, set deliberately by Russian hands to deny the occupier the resources of the capital. Napoleon was appalled. He reportedly declared that this was a war of extermination, a strategy without precedent in civilized history, and expressed astonishment at the ferocity of a people willing to burn their own greatest city rather than submit. He waited 5 weeks. No envoys came. With winter approaching and his supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of increasingly hostile territory, he ordered the retreat that became one of the most catastrophic military withdrawals in recorded history. As the Grande Armée moved westward through the snow, it was harassed continuously by partisan forces. Small detachments of peasants and regular soldiers who emerged from the forests, struck at stragglers and supply columns, then disappeared again. Alexander was nervous about arming and mobilizing peasants too openly, correctly understanding that peasants who fought for Russia might expect to be freed from serfdom as their reward. The disturbances that occurred when some peasants tried to volunteer and were turned away by recruiting sergeants confirmed his anxiety. The serf system and the military defense of the empire were pulling in opposite directions. Russia's victory was total, and its psychological effect was transformative. The educated elite that had absorbed French language and French culture over the preceding century, that had danced in St. Petersburg ballrooms to French music and read French philosophy in French drawing rooms, had just defeated France on the battlefield. Young officers who had pursued Napoleon's retreating army across Europe, through Germany and into France itself, had seen with their own eyes how Western European countries were organized. They had seen constitutional governments, free presses, legal systems that applied equally to nobles and commoners, civic institutions through which educated citizens participated in public life. They returned to Russia and looked at what they had come home to with new and uncomfortable eyes. The result was the Decembrist revolt of December 1825 AD. When Alexander I died suddenly, a group of reform-minded army officers used the moment of succession confusion to stage an uprising in St. Petersburg, demanding a constitution and representative government. It was poorly planned, improvised at the last moment, and easily suppressed by the new Tsar, Nicholas I. 5 of the leaders were hanged. Hundreds were exiled to Siberia. The revolt lasted a single day and achieved nothing in immediate political terms. Its long-term significance was immense. The Decembrists were the first organized political opposition in Russian history to base their demands not on the restoration of traditional privileges or the correction of specific abuses, but on universal principles of constitutional government derived from European Enlightenment thought. They were also the first educated Russians to be punished specifically for holding political ideas rather than for threatening the dynasty or committing acts of violence. Nicholas I drew from their revolt the lesson that any concession to liberal sentiment was the first step toward revolution, and he governed for the next 30 years on that premise, censoring the press, monitoring the universities, exiling troublemakers, and treating the very existence of independent political thought as a threat to the state. This repression produced, almost as a direct consequence, something that Russia gave to the world and that the world has been trying to define ever since. The intelligentsia. The word itself is Russian, and it describes a social type that emerged specifically from the conditions Nicholas I created. These were educated men and women, nearly all men in the early decades, who had been trained in the universities and technical institutions that Peter I and his successors had built, who worked as doctors, lawyers, teachers, writers, and administrators, and who found themselves excluded from meaningful participation in political life while being entirely capable of understanding its failures. They could not act politically. They could think, write, and argue. And in the absence of any legitimate political arena, they did so with an intensity and a moral seriousness that transformed Russian literature and thought into something that carried political weight precisely because it had no other outlet. The Crimean War did what 30 years of intelligentsia argument could not. It made the case for reform in a language that autocracy understood: military defeat. Russia lost the war not through lack of courage. Its soldiers fought with the same stubborn determination that had always been their defining quality, but through systemic failures that no amount of individual bravery could compensate for. Britain and France moved troops thousands of miles across the sea, faster than Russia could move its own army a few hundred miles across its own territory, because Russia had no railways connecting its interior to the front. Its officers were courtiers trained in parade ground formality, rather than professional soldiers trained in staff work and logistics. Its weapons were outdated. Its supply system collapsed under pressures that a modern military administration would have managed without difficulty. The absence of a trained reserve meant Russia had to maintain its entire standing army permanently under arms, an expense that crippled state finances while producing a force that could not be in 2 places at once. The new emperor, Alexander II, came to the throne in the middle of this humiliation and drew the correct conclusion. Russia had to reform, or it would continue to fall behind the industrializing nation-states of Western Europe. The question was not whether to reform, but how. And the answer to how was constrained at every turn by the serf system that lay beneath everything else. Serfdom had to go. Both the Westerners and Slavophiles who had argued across the Nicholas years agreed on this much, even if they agreed on little else. The dilemma was expressed with bleak precision by one landowner, who articulated what everyone involved already knew. To free the peasants without land was impossible, but to expropriate the landowners would be unjust. The ruling class could not be stripped of its economic base. But peasants given freedom without land would simply become a landless rural proletariat, desperate, mobile, and dangerous. The Emancipation Edict of 1861 AD was the result of years of committee work, competing proposals, and the kind of political negotiation that happens when a state tries to restructure the fundamental basis of its economy without destroying the class that runs it. What emerged was a compromise that satisfied almost nobody, and that embedded its own contradictions so deeply that they would take another half-century to fully detonate. Landowners retained the most fertile portions of their estates, particularly in the Black Earth South, where agricultural land was genuinely valuable. Peasants received allotments, but allotments that were in many cases smaller than the land they had previously worked, and for which they were required to pay redemption payments spread over 49 years. They were not freed as full individual citizens. Until their debt was paid, they remained tied to their land commune, still subject to joint responsibility, still a segregated social estate governed by customary law, rather than the statute law that applied to everyone else. In a very real sense, the commune had simply replaced the landlord as the institutional frame within which the peasant was bound. The liberation of 23 million serfs from personal bondage was nonetheless a genuine achievement, arguably the most significant single act of the Russian state in the 19th century. And it came about precisely because the autocracy, answerable to no landed parliament as in Western Europe, could override the interests of the noble class when it judged the alternative worse. This was the argument that defenders of autocracy had always made, that a strong, unconstrained ruler could take decisions that representative governments, captive to elite interests, could not. For once, the argument was true. Emancipation made further reforms both possible and necessary. The administrative and judicial functions that landlords had exercised over their serfs had to be replaced by something. Alexander created zemstvos, elected assemblies at provincial and district level, to handle local government, public health, education, and infrastructure. The zemstvos were dominated by the nobility and property owners, but they included representation from other classes, including peasants, and they provided the first institutional space in Russian history where educated professionals could engage in genuine public service without being state officials. Doctors, teachers, statisticians, and agronomists hired by the zemstvos began the slow work of building a civil society from the bottom up. The judicial reform of 1864 AD was the most radical of all. It created an entirely new court system with trained lawyers, independent judges who could not be removed by administrative order, and juries of ordinary citizens empowered to reach verdicts in criminal cases. Proceedings were open to the public and to the press. For the first time in Russian history, law was to be administered by professionals, applying consistent standards rather than by officials exercising personal discretion backed by administrative authority. The implicit message was revolutionary. Laws applied to governments as well as to subjects. The courts were, in principle, independent of the executive power. The tension this created with autocracy became visible almost immediately. In 1878 AD, a young revolutionary named Vera Zasalich walked into the office of General Trepov, the Governor-General of St. Petersburg, and shot him. She did not deny the act. Her lawyer argued that she had acted not from personal malice, but from political conviction, that Trepov had ordered the flogging of a political prisoner in violation of the law, and that she had responded to official lawlessness with individual resistance. The jury acquitted her. The courtroom erupted in applause. As she left, she was immediately rearrested on administrative order, demonstrating in a single sequence the contradiction between the reformed judicial system and the autocratic state that surrounded it. Alexander himself understood the dilemma his reforms had created without being able to resolve it. When his interior minister proposed allowing elected Zemstvo representatives into the State Council, Russia's highest advisory body, Alexander refused, not on the grounds that it would limit his power, but because he feared that giving non-Russian elites a formal voice in imperial governance would accelerate the centrifugal forces already pulling the empire apart. Poland had rebelled in 1863 AD. Ukraine was developing a distinct literary culture that Russian officials found threatening enough to ban. Finland was agitating for greater autonomy. The empire was, in some fundamental sense, incompatible with the representative institutions that reform logic pointed toward. While reformers argued about constitutions and revolutionaries debated tactics, something older and deeper was working its way through Russian society. A question that politics alone could never answer. What did it actually mean to be Russian? The answer was inseparable from faith. Not faith as theology, argued in seminaries and synodal committees, but faith as it was, lived in the village, practiced in the parish, and defended when authority demanded its surrender. The old believer schism of the 17th century had never healed. What had begun as a dispute over whether to cross oneself with 2 fingers or 3, a change so apparently trivial that later historians struggled to take it seriously, was in reality a conflict about something far more fundamental. The old believers were not defending a liturgical detail. They were defending their understanding of what Russia was. The official church, reformed under Patriarch Nikon and subordinated under Peter I to state administration, had become in their eyes an instrument of an increasingly alien power. A power that shaved beards, built cities on swamps, dressed its nobles in German clothing, and now told ordinary Russians that the prayers their grandparents had said were wrong. Thousands chose suffering over compliance. Some communities facing military suppression locked themselves in their wooden churches and burned rather than accept the new rites. These were not acts of fanaticism in any simple sense. They were acts of political defiance expressed in the only language available to people who had no army, no legal rights, and no institutional voice. The willingness to die rather than cross oneself incorrectly was a statement that there were things the state could not reach, that the soul of Russia, as ordinary believers understood it, was not the Tsar's to reform. Old believer communities survived, multiplied, and in many cases prospered across the 18th and 19th centuries despite intermittent persecution. Many became successful merchants and manufacturers, their communal discipline and mutual trust giving them advantages in commerce that the wider society, atomized by serfdom and bureaucratic interference, could not easily replicate. Their continued existence was a permanent reproach to the official church and a living reminder that Russian identity had roots the state had never successfully controlled. The writers who shaped Russian culture in the 19th century were wrestling with the same underlying question from a different direction. Dostoevsky, in novel after novel set in the cramped apartments and taverns of St. Petersburg, returned obsessively to the spiritual catastrophe he believed Western rationalism had inflicted on the Russian soul. His characters are not destroyed by poverty or political oppression in any simple sense. They are destroyed by ideas, by the logic of a world in which God has been removed, and human beings are left to construct their own moral frameworks from the materials of pure reason. The underground man who sticks out his tongue at rational self-interest, Raskolnikov, who convinces himself that extraordinary people are entitled to transgress ordinary moral law. These were not merely literary creations. They were diagnoses of what Dostoevsky believed happened to a person and a civilization when the communal faith that had held Russian life together was replaced by the cold arithmetic of European modernity. Tolstoy arrived at a different but related conclusion. Russia had defeated Napoleon, he argued, in war and peace, not through strategic brilliance but through the moral coherence of ordinary people, peasants and soldiers who had preserved a simple, instinctive sense of community and right conduct that sophisticated atheist Europeans had long since lost. In his later years, Tolstoy carried this conviction to its logical extreme, rejecting both state and church as institutions of organized violence, founding a personal religion based on the ethics of mutual cooperation, and living as close to peasant life as a count with an estate could manage. The pressure that Russian culture had been absorbing for decades found its first political explosion not in a revolutionary conspiracy, but in a procession of workers carrying icons and singing hymns. On a Sunday morning in January 1905 AD, a crowd estimated at somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 people moved through the streets of St. Petersburg toward the Winter Palace. They were led by a priest named Gapon, who had organized them through a workers' association that operated with the tacit approval of the city's metropolitan. They carried portraits of the Tsar and religious banners. They were not armed. Their petition requested the right to elect worker representatives in factories, an 8-hour working day, and a constituent assembly elected by all the people. It was, in its framing, an appeal to the Tsar as the benevolent father figure of peasant political imagination. The belief, stretching back centuries, that the Tsar's genuine intentions were being frustrated by corrupt intermediaries. The troops who met them fired into the crowd. The exact death toll of what immediately became known as Bloody Sunday was disputed then and remains disputed now. Estimates range from dozens to several hundred, but the number mattered less than what the event destroyed. The image of the Tsar as the people's protector, the moral foundation on which Russian popular loyalty to the autocracy had rested for generations, was shattered in a single afternoon. What the intelligentsia had argued in drawing rooms and underground pamphlets, what revolutionaries had tried to demonstrate through assassinations and propaganda, the government had accomplished itself with troops and rifle fire on a winter Sunday. The eruption that followed spread across the empire with a speed that demonstrated how extensively the conditions for unrest had been building. Peasants across the countryside met in their village assemblies and drew up petitions, still mostly addressed to the Tsar, still framed in the language of loyal subjects requesting relief. But the substance of their demands was radical. All private landed property should be abolished. All land should belong to the communities that worked it. A legislative assembly should be elected by universal suffrage. Workers in the cities went on strike. Non-Russian nationalities, Poles, Finns, Baltic peoples, Georgians, added their own demands for autonomy or independence to the general ferment. The most organizationally significant development of 1905 AD was the emergence of the Soviets. Workers in St. Petersburg and then in other cities elected delegates to citywide councils, Soviets, that coordinated strike action and, at their height, effectively took over municipal administration. The St. Petersburg Soviet, chaired by the young Menshevik Leon Trotsky, called a general strike in October that paralyzed the capital and spread rapidly to other cities. It was this, not the rural unrest, not the military mutinies, not the assassinations, that finally forced Nicholas II to act. The October Manifesto of 1905 AD promised the creation of a State Duma, a legislative assembly elected by a procedure that included most adult males, whose consent would be required for all future legislation. It was the most significant constitutional concession in Russian history. It was also, from the moment of its issue, surrounded by ambiguity that undermined everything it promised. Nicholas remained the autocrat. An upper chamber appointed largely by himself sat alongside the elected Duma. Within months, he was looking for ways to limit and eventually reverse what he had conceded. The first Duma, elected in 1906 AD with massive popular participation, arrived dominated by representatives demanding exactly what the peasant petitions had requested: radical land reform, genuine constitutional government, accountability for Bloody Sunday. The government dissolved it before it had sat for 3 months. The Second Duma produced similar results and was dissolved in turn. Prime Minister Stolypin then changed the electoral law to give overwhelming weight to landowners and Russian nationals, producing a Third Duma compliant enough to function, but so unrepresentative that it had no credibility with the population it claimed to represent. Stolypin himself had a more serious vision than simple repression. He pushed through a reform allowing peasants to leave the commune and consolidate their strips into individual enclosed farms, intending to create a class of prosperous small landowners with a material stake in the existing order. The reform was partially implemented before his assassination in 1911 AD, shot in a Kiev theatre in circumstances that suggested the security services knew more than they disclosed. But it ran against the grain of peasant communal culture deeply enough that many villages simply continued their collective arrangements, regardless of what the law permitted. The First World War arrived in August 1914 AD into a political system that had been under acute strain for nearly a decade. The initial response was the surge of patriotic unity that wars typically produce. Crowds cheering in the streets, the Duma voting war credits, Zemstvos organizing medical and supply services for the army. It did not last. Military defeats, catastrophic casualties, the loss of Poland in 1915 AD, ammunition shortages at the front and food shortages in the rear, inflation that eroded urban living standards. All of this reconstituted the pre-war confrontational atmosphere in a form made more volatile by the scale of what was now at stake. Into this deteriorating situation came the figure of Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian peasant mystic who had gained the Empress Alexandra's absolute trust through his apparent ability to manage the bleeding episodes of her hemophiliac son, Alexei. Rasputin used his access to the imperial family to influence court appointments and, increasingly, government policy. He was dissolute, manipulative, and entirely without qualification for the political role he was playing. The newspapers, which operated under significantly looser censorship than before 1905 AD, covered his antics with the relish of an audience that had been waiting years for confirmation that the court was as corrupt as they had suspected. The Empress's German birth, entirely unremarkable in the context of European royal marriages, became, in the fevered atmosphere of wartime, a basis for whispered accusations of treason that reached into the highest levels of the military command. In February 1917 AD, food shortages combined with workers' grievances brought hundreds of thousands onto the streets of Petrograd, as St. Petersburg had been renamed at the outbreak of war to remove its German sound. The demonstrations did not disperse when ordered. The troops sent to suppress them began to fraternize with the crowds instead. Within days, the garrison of the capital had effectively changed sides. Duma politicians, recognizing that Nicholas had become indefensible, sent a delegation to him at military headquarters. His own generals, whose overriding priority was a united nation behind the war effort, concurred that he had to go. Nicholas II abdicated in a railway carriage on the 2nd of March, 1917 AD. The last Romanov Tsar, ending a dynasty that had ruled Russia for 304 years. Russia was suddenly without a monarch for the first time since the time of troubles. A provisional government of Duma politicians took power, committed to continuing the war and holding elections for a constituent assembly that would decide Russia's permanent form of government. Alongside it, immediately and spontaneously, the Soviets reappeared. In Petrograd, then in cities across the country, then in the army itself. The dual power that resulted was not a stable arrangement. It was two incompatible claims to legitimacy existing simultaneously in the same space, waiting for one to eliminate the other. The civil war that followed the Bolshevik seizure of power lasted nearly 5 years and killed more Russians than the First World War had. When it ended, the Reds had won. But what they had won was a country in ruins. Its industry collapsed, its agriculture devastated, its population exhausted and reduced by war, famine, and disease, on a scale that defied easy comprehension. Lenin's response to economic collapse was pragmatic in a way that surprised those who had taken Bolshevik ideology at face value. The new economic policy of 1921 allowed limited private trade and small-scale private enterprise to restart the economy. Peasants could sell surplus grain on the open market, small businesses could operate legally. The commanding heights of the economy, heavy industry, banking, foreign trade, remained in state hands, but the rigid war communism that had requisitioned grain directly from peasant households at gunpoint was abandoned. The economy recovered. The peasants, for the first time since the revolution, had reason to produce more than they consumed. Lenin died in January 1924, and the question of succession opened a struggle within the Bolshevik leadership that consumed the rest of the decade. Joseph Stalin, who had become General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1922, used the position with a methodical patience that his rivals consistently underestimated. The General Secretary controlled appointments, who got which post, who was promoted, who was transferred to a distant province where they could cause no trouble. Stalin used this power to build a network of loyalists throughout the party apparatus, while his more intellectually brilliant rivals, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Bukharin, fought each other over doctrinal questions and assumed that organizational work was beneath them. By the late 1920s, Stalin had outmaneuvered every significant rival. Trotsky was expelled from the party in 1927 and eventually from the Soviet Union entirely in 1929. The new economic policy, which Bukharin had defended as a long-term framework for gradual socialist development, was abandoned. In 1928, Stalin launched the first of the 5-year plans, a program of forced industrialization intended to transform the Soviet Union from a predominantly agricultural country into a modern industrial power within a single generation. The arithmetic of industrialization required a net transfer of resources from the countryside to the cities and factories. Grain had to be extracted from the villages to feed the growing urban workforce and to sell abroad for the foreign currency needed to buy industrial machinery. When the state offered prices for grain that peasants considered too low, peasants responded by reducing their deliveries and consuming more themselves. This was rational market behavior. Stalin interpreted it as class warfare, deliberate sabotage by kulaks. The term applied to wealthier peasants who were designated class enemies regardless of the often minimal differences that separated them from their neighbors. The response was collectivization, the forced merger of individual peasant households into collective farms, kolkhozy, run by appointed officials who could ensure that grain deliveries reached state targets regardless of what the peasants themselves wanted. It was implemented with the speed and violence of a military campaign. Plenipotentiaries arrived in villages with quotas and instructions. Households that resisted were labeled kulaks and subject to dekulakization, a process that meant, in practice, confiscation of property and deportation to remote regions of Siberia and the far north, where the deported were dumped without adequate food, shelter, or clothing. The most dangerous elements, as the orders defined them, were simply shot. Peasants responded with the weapons available to them. They slaughtered their livestock rather than surrender it to the collective. Between 1929 and 1933, the Soviet Union lost roughly half its horses, cattle, and pigs. Animals that represented not only food, but the motive power of agriculture itself. The destruction was so vast that Soviet livestock numbers did not recover to pre-collectivization levels for a generation. Some peasants actually believed, as survivors later testified, that the reign of Antichrist had come, that anyone who entered a collective farm would be branded with the mark of the beast. The village church was usually closed as part of the process, the priest arrested, the icons confiscated. For communities whose entire rhythm of life had been organized around the agricultural calendar and the liturgical year simultaneously, this was not merely economic disruption. It was the annihilation of a world. The famine that resulted from collectivization killed millions. The effects were worst in Ukraine, the most productive grain-growing region of the Soviet Union, where the campaign was conducted with particular ruthlessness, and where Ukrainian national sentiment made the authorities additionally suspicious of any resistance. Brigades went from house to house confiscating not only grain, but any food they could find. Stored vegetables, dried fruit, anything that might allow a family to survive until the next harvest. People died in their villages, on the roads, in the cities where they had fled looking for food. Ukrainians today call this the Holodomor, the hunger famine, and debate continues about whether it constitutes genocide in the legal sense, though the deliberate character of the policies that produced it is no longer seriously disputed by mainstream historians. By the mid-1930s, the immediate crisis of collectivization had stabilized into a new and permanent misery. The collective farm system worked after a fashion. It delivered grain to the state, but it destroyed the agricultural productivity and the human dignity of the rural population simultaneously. The traditional village commune, with its self-governance and periodic redistribution of resources, had been replaced by an institution in which appointed officials controlled everything, and peasants had no more rights than they had possessed under serfdom. Some peasants explicitly called it a second serfdom. The comparison was not hyperbole. The terror that erupted in 1937 and 1938 was not a continuation of collectivization by other means. It had its own logic, rooted in the psychology of a leadership that had spent decades in conspiratorial underground activity, had fought a desperate civil war, and had imposed traumatic social transformation on a resistant population, and had emerged from all of this with the unshakable conviction that enemies were everywhere, and that any difficulty was evidence of sabotage rather than policy failure. Between the 17th Party Congress in 1934 and the 18th in 1939, 110 out of 139 members of the Central Committee were arrested. Of 1,966 delegates who attended the 17th Congress, over 1,100 had disappeared by the time of the 18th. Show trials were staged at which former leaders of the revolution, men who had worked alongside Lenin, who had built the party and fought the Civil War, confessed to fantastic conspiracies involving foreign powers and terrorist plots. Most confessed under interrogation techniques that combined physical exhaustion, psychological pressure, and threats against family members. Some may also have confessed out of a final, terrible act of party loyalty. The conviction that if the party required this sacrifice, they had no framework of belief outside the party from which to refuse. The answer to whether a state built on terror could inspire genuine loyalty came in the summer of 1941. And it was more complicated than either the state's defenders or its critics expected. When Germany invaded in June of that year, the Red Army, its officer corps decimated by the purges, its command structures disrupted, its early warning intelligence ignored by Stalin, who refused to believe his own sources, collapsed with a speed that shocked even the Germans. Entire armies were encircled and captured. In the first months of the war, the Soviet Union lost territories, populations, and industrial capacity on a scale that would have finished most states entirely. By the autumn, German forces stood at the outskirts of Moscow and had reached the Volga at Stalingrad. What happened next defied the predictions of everyone who had assumed that a population brutalized by collectivization, the terror, and the destruction of everything that had given village life its meaning, would have no particular reason to fight for the system that had done these things to them. They fought anyway. And they fought with a ferocity and endurance that eventually turned the war around. The reasons were multiple and cannot be reduced to a single explanation. German occupation policy, which treated Slavic peoples as subhuman and suitable for enslavement or extermination, removed any possibility that the invaders might be welcomed as liberators even by those with genuine grievances against Soviet power. Russian and Soviet patriotism, the two had been deliberately fused during the 1930s, proved more durable than the terror had destroyed, and the Communist Party, whatever its crimes, possessed an organizational capacity to prioritize resources and direct them to where they were needed that no other institution in Soviet society could replicate. The Battle of Stalingrad, fought from August 1942 to February 1943, became the turning point. Not only militarily, but symbolically. The city bore Stalin's name, which gave its defense a significance beyond its strategic value. The fighting that took place there, building by building and floor by floor through the ruins of an industrial city, was among the most brutal urban combat in military history. When the German Sixth Army surrendered in February 1943, the psychological shift across the entire war was immediate and lasting. The Wehrmacht had been stopped and destroyed at the place that bore the Soviet leader's name. The war was not won at Stalingrad. 2 more years of devastating fighting remained, but after it, the direction was no longer in doubt. Victory in May 1945 transformed Soviet political culture in ways that outlasted the Soviet Union itself. The 1917 revolution, which had been the founding myth of the Soviet state, was gradually displaced in the popular consciousness by the war, the Great Patriotic War, as it was officially named, as the central event that justified everything. This shift had profound implications. The revolution had been a story about class struggle, international solidarity, and the overthrow of the old order. The war was a story about Russian survival, national resilience, and the defense of the motherland against a genocidal enemy. It was a story that united rather than divided, that every Soviet citizen, regardless of class origin or national background, could participate in, and that required no ideological sophistication to understand. Stalin died in March 1953. The relief among his immediate successors was palpable and unconcealed. They moved within days to bring the security police under party control, preventing any single figure from using it as Stalin had used it, as an instrument of terror against the leadership itself. The question of what to do with Stalin's legacy, however, was far more difficult than the question of how to prevent another Stalin. Nikita Khrushchev resolved this, partially and selectively, at the 20th Party Congress in February 1956. In a speech delivered to a closed session of delegates, though its content spread rapidly through Soviet society and beyond, he denounced Stalin's repression of party members, his cult of personality, and his deportation of entire nationalities. The speech was carefully bounded. It said nothing about collectivization, nothing about the famine, nothing about the destruction of the peasantry. It was a denunciation of Stalin's crimes against the party, not against the Soviet people as a whole, but it was enough to shatter something that could not be repaired. The party had claimed infallibility as the foundation of its right to rule. Khrushchev had just admitted in the party's own forum that it had committed monstrous crimes. The question that followed, who could guarantee it would not do so again, had no satisfactory answer. Khrushchev genuinely believed that the Soviet system could be reformed, humanized, and made to deliver on its promises. He released hundreds of thousands of Gulag prisoners. He launched a massive housing construction program that, by the 1960s, had given most Soviet urban families their own apartments for the first time. A transformation in daily life whose significance is difficult to overstate for people who had previously shared communal apartments with multiple families. He promised that by 1980 the Soviet Union would overtake the United States in industrial output and achieve the material prerequisites for communism. The promise was sincere. It was also a measure of how disconnected the leadership had become from the actual condition of the economy it was managing. Khrushchev fell in October 1964, removed by a Central Committee vote organized by officials who resented his attempts to limit their tenure and who had tired of his impulsive management style. His successor, Leonid Brezhnev, offered the nomenklatura elite something Khrushchev had threatened to take away: security. Under Brezhnev's policy of stability of cadres, senior officials could expect to hold their positions indefinitely, build their patron-client networks without interference from above, and enjoy the material privileges of their rank without the anxiety that a sudden shift in the leadership's mood might cost them everything. The result was a society that stabilized into a particular kind of managed stagnation. The terror was gone. The arbitrary violence of the Stalin years was not coming back, but neither was meaningful reform. The economy continued to function, badly, wastefully, kept afloat partly by rising oil revenues that papered over structural failures. And Soviet citizens developed an elaborate set of accommodations with the system's dysfunctions that became, over time, a way of life. Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party in March 1985 at the age of 54, young by the standards of a leadership that had been aging visibly in office for 2 decades. He was not a dissident. He was not a closet liberal waiting for his moment. He was a product of the Soviet system who had risen through its ranks in the conventional way, and who had arrived at the conclusion, through his own observation and through the work of reformist thinkers in the party's international department, that the system was failing and that the failure would become catastrophic if nothing changed. His initial diagnosis was relatively modest. The Soviet economy was inefficient, its management corrupt and self-serving, its technological development falling behind the West at an accelerating rate. The solution he envisioned was not the dismantling of socialism, but its renewal, removing the calcified layer of Brezhnev-era officials who had made their careers out of managing decline, introducing accountability and transparency into a system that had operated in deliberate obscurity, and releasing the genuine productive capacity that he believed existed within Soviet society, but was being smothered by bureaucratic inertia. The Chernobyl nuclear explosion of April 1986 changed the trajectory of everything. When the reactor at the Chernobyl plant in Ukraine exploded, local and regional officials spent critical hours minimizing and concealing the severity of the disaster. From Moscow, from the population living in the contamination zone, and from the international community. Gorbachev learned the full truth only days after the explosion, through channels that bypassed the officials who were managing the information. The experience confirmed what he had suspected and hardened into conviction what had previously been a reformist inclination. A system in which officials automatically concealed bad news from their superiors, in which institutional self-protection overrode every other consideration, including the physical safety of the population, was not simply inefficient. It was dangerous in ways that could no longer be managed through internal adjustment. Within months, he had broadened his reform program from the cautious anti-corruption campaign he had initially envisioned into something qualitatively different. Glasnost, openness, became genuine freedom of speech in practice, if not yet in law. Newspapers began publishing accounts of Stalin's crimes that went beyond Khrushchev's carefully bounded 1956 revelations. Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, the 3-volume account of the Soviet penal system that had circulated in underground copies for years, was published legally and in mass editions. Television broadcast live the proceedings of the new Congress of People's Deputies in May 1989. An assembly elected through partially competitive elections that was the closest thing to genuine representative politics the Soviet Union had ever produced. Much of the population took time off work to watch. Speaker after speaker rose to denounce the abuses of the nomenklatura, the failures of the economy, the crimes of the past. It was riveting, and it was destabilizing, simultaneously. Perestroika, restructuring, introduced legal private enterprise alongside the state economy. The intention was that private businesses would complement the planned system, filling gaps and improving efficiency. The actual effect was different. Private enterprises could offer higher prices to suppliers than the state system paid, which meant goods flowed out of the official economy into the private one. creating shortages in state shops that ordinary consumers depended on. By 1990, it was becoming unclear whether routine food supplies could be reliably maintained in major cities. The reform that was supposed to improve the economy had disrupted the informal mechanisms, the black networks, the workplace distribution systems, through which people had actually been obtaining the necessities of daily life. The social contract on which urban stability had rested, cheap food in exchange for political compliance, was breaking down. The nationalities question, which the Soviet federal structure had simultaneously fostered and suppressed for 7 decades, erupted with a speed that overwhelmed the center's capacity to respond. The Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, incorporated into the Soviet Union under the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939 in circumstances that had never been fully legitimized, even in Soviet legal terms. Moved from demands for autonomy to demands for full independence. Armenians and Azerbaijanis went to war over Nagorno-Karabakh. Georgia faced secessionist movements in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. In April 1989, Soviet troops used sharpened sappers' shovels to disperse a demonstration in Tbilisi, killing 20 people. And the incident triggered a legal and political crisis about the army's right to act against its own civilian population that the command structure was not equipped to resolve. Outside the Soviet Union, the outer empire disintegrated with remarkable speed and, largely, remarkable peacefulness. The Berlin Wall fell in November 1989. One by one, the communist governments of Eastern Europe were replaced through elections or negotiated transitions. The Warsaw Pact ceased to have any practical meaning. Everything the Soviet Union had gained through the victory of 1945, the victory that had replaced the revolution as the system's founding myth, was gone within 2 years. The final crisis took the form that nobody had predicted, a confrontation between the Soviet Union and Russia itself. Boris Yeltsin, who had been a Gorbachev ally before becoming his most effective critic, won election as President of the Russian Republic in June 1991, the first genuinely competitive popular election for executive office in Russian history. He used the platform to demand that Russia be allowed to govern its own affairs and to relentlessly expose the privileges and failures of the Communist Party apparatus. He represented something the Soviet system had never successfully produced. A politician with a genuine popular mandate, answerable to voters rather than to a party hierarchy. The conservative faction within the communist leadership watched all of this and decided in August 1991 that it had to be stopped. On the 19th of August, a self-declared emergency committee placed Gorbachev under house arrest at his Crimean dacha, announced a state of emergency, and moved tanks into central Moscow. The coup was organized by the heads of the KGB, the Defense Ministry, and other senior figures who believed they were saving the Soviet Union from dissolution. What they had failed to account for was Yeltsin. He drove to the Russian Parliament building, the White House. And when a column of tanks appeared outside it, he climbed onto one of them and addressed the crowd that had gathered to resist the coup. He declared the emergency committee's actions a crime against the legally elected authorities of the Russian Republic and called on soldiers and citizens to resist. His action was not merely symbolic. It created a focal point of legitimate authority at the moment when the coup plotters needed uncertainty and passivity to succeed. Television cameras recorded everything. The images went around the world. The army commanders, faced with the choice between firing on a crowd that included the elected president of Russia standing on one of their own tanks and simply declining to act, chose inaction. Without military enforcement, the emergency committee had nothing. The coup collapsed within 3 days. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but to a different Moscow than the one he had left. Yeltsin had outlawed the Communist Party in Russia. Ukraine declared independence. Within days, the other republics followed. In December 1991, Yeltsin met with the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus in a hunting lodge in the Belovezha forest and signed a declaration stating that the Soviet Union, as a subject of international law and geopolitical reality, had ceased to exist. They announced the formation of a commonwealth of independent states and invited the other former Soviet republics to join. On the 25th of December 1991, Gorbachev resigned. That evening, the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin and replaced by the red, white, and blue tricolour of Russia. The hammer and sickle came down. The double-headed eagle, the symbol of the Tsarist Empire that Peter I had adopted from Byzantium 5 centuries earlier, did not go back up immediately. Russia was searching for a symbol because it was searching for an identity, and the search that had occupied its writers, its revolutionaries, its reformers, and its ordinary people for centuries had not produced a settled answer. What was Russia without an empire to define it? What was it without the Tsar, without the party, without the divine mission of the Third Rome or the secular mission of world communism? The flat open plain was still there. The rivers still ran to the same seas. The churches, whose bells had been silenced for 70 years, were beginning to ring again across a country that was simultaneously the oldest and the newest state in Europe. The question that had run through everything, from the Varangian traders on the Dnieper to the tanks outside the Moscow White House, from Vladimir's baptism in the river to Yeltsin's defiance on the tank, had not been answered. It had only been asked again in a new form by a people with 1,000 years of practice at surviving whatever history chose to throw at them next. Russia endures. How it endures. That remains, as it has always been, the open question. If this documentary has given you a sense of the vast, complicated, enduring story that produced the Russia of today, share it, save it, and if you want to go deeper into any chapter of this history, let us know in the comments. Subscribe for more documentaries that take history seriously.